Hi, everyone, and a warm welcome to Researcher's Desk. Oh, it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Heather Wood, who's going to be speaking with us today. She's going to be speaking with us about microclimate, about biodiversity, about Swedish forests, and how those climate and biodiversity, what are the drivers. Heather's at both Stockholm University and at the Swedish Agricultural University, SLU. And it's a real pleasure. We really appreciate, Heather, that you're taking your time to speak with us today. We're all super interested to listen to you and learn from you. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to turn my own camera off, but I will pop up in the back immediately if anything technical goes wrong. So you can just assume everything's running just fine. So if you'd like to go ahead and share your screen, I'll just be visible until you've done that, just in case. Okay,
Right.
that's looking lovely. I'll be turning my camera off now. Heather, warm welcome to Researcher's Desk.
Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for coming today. So I'm going to talk to you today about microclimate and biodiversity in Swedish forests. And this is partly some of the work that I did during my PhD at Stockholm University, where I was interested in how climate and landscape changes are affecting bats. So I'm a bat biologist, but I also work with insects. Mostly with moths, but they are my taxa of interest, and bats are a very interesting organism to look at when you look at forests, especially in Sweden. All the bats that we have in Sweden are eating insects, and they are top predators in the ecosystem. So bats are often seen as a very good bio-indicator of how habitats are doing. Um, so that is a little bit of my focus, but I won't just talk about my research. I will also talk about in the broader context and some other taxa as well that are important to understand within Swedish forests. Um, so before I begin, I want to kind of sort of frame a little bit about the history and the sort of the status of Swedish forests. Now, if you're Swedish and you do research in Sweden in biodiversity, you're probably quite aware that we are a country of forest. It's 68% of our land area. And this map shows the proportion of forest in each region of Sweden, divided by whether it's production forest, i.e. plantation forestry, or whether it's non-productive. So the green parts of those pie charts are production forest, and the purpley pink colours are the non-productive forest. So what you can see is that the majority of our forest is actually production. So 57% of the total land area in Sweden is plantation forestry. And I think this is something that kind of shocks people when I talk to people outside of Sweden or out of Scandinavia. They don't realize this, that so much of our forest is managed, and it's managed very intensively. A lot of this plantation is dominated by two species, coniferous species, spruce and pine. And these forests are often quite poor in terms of species. They have very even age structure. The trees are typically the similar age and also quite young forests. We have a rotation period of forestry between 50 and 100 years in Sweden, so quite a young age structure. And also the younger forests tend to be quite dense. There are a few gaps in them. So what would be sort of define those as being structurally simple? The vegetation structure is very, very simple. Um, and in terms of species, I've already said that spruce and pine are dominant, but this is to show you how or what the composition looks like. 40% of the forest is spruce or pine, with only about 12% having birch and only 8% of other deciduous trees. So it really is a very species poor forest in terms of tree species. But what's the perspective in the historical perspective of this? How did it look in the past? Well, forests were very different in Sweden in the past, especially in southern parts of Sweden. And we've seen a huge amount of land use change, especially since the 1900s. And we've seen a lot of 17% loss of open land, for example. And that open land has primarily been afforested to coniferous plantations. And this has led to a widespread homogenization of the landscape. We have huge areas of plantation forestry. And actually, a study from Alasdair from SLU has shown that two-thirds of landscapes in southern Sweden are less heterogeneous today than they were in the past. And as I said, this forest is predominantly plantation forest. But in the past, it wasn't quite like this. We had a lot of low intensity management of our forests. And actually, the management of forests was very closely tied to agriculture. So farmers were often using forests to graze their animals, maybe also for charcoal production, selective felling of wood for timber. And a lot of our forests were more naturally wet than they are today. And all this led to forests which had more deciduous trees and shrubs. They were semi-open, they had a lot more gaps in the canopy, and they had multiple layers. So you had understory, mid-story layers as well. But how were the forests perceived? Well, I think this quote from Linnaeus is quite telling of the time in the 1700s. Linnaeus, who is one of our probably most eminent biologists, didn't really appreciate Swedish forests as they were. And he said the large forests are desolate and wasteful because no one needs the timber which falls down and decays. And unfortunately, this was the viewpoint of forests at this time in Sweden. It was felt that they had been overgrazed, they were mismanaged, they were too open, and they weren't true forests. And so there was a huge movement to improve the forestry management in Sweden. And improve it, I mean, in terms of production and timber production. And so it basically led to a huge loss of these old growth forests that we had. So in the 1910s, for example, 83% of our forest was old growth forest. That meant that there were trees over 150 years old were dominating. And only within 70 years, by the 1980s, less than 3% of our forest was old growth. And the forests look quite typically like that picture on the right. So very young aged trees, even aged stands, very little understory, no mid-story present at all in that photo. Compared to the photo on the other side, just a bit tricky to see, but you can get the idea that there's more structural levels in that forest. There's more understory, more mid-story, there's different ages of trees. The structure has completely changed. And what sort of drove that? Here's a sort of potted history of Swedish forestry. Pre-19th century, selective felling was really the predominant method of extraction, and no replanting of forests typically happened, or there was no requirement to do so at least. Forests were grazed with cattle and sheep and horses. But in 1903, because there was so much concern about the forest being in bad condition, the Forestry Act was brought in. And one of the big requirements of that was that you should replant after felling. In the 1920s to 30s, a lot happened to Swedish forests. Forest grazing was banned, and there was wide-scale draining and ditching of our forests. So most of the forests became dry. And the concern there was that when you did clear cutting, you might end up the clear cuts flooding. So that was one of the reasons, but also it facilitated planting the trees when they ditched and drained them. And by the 1950s, we had pretty much exclusively switched to clear cutting as a method in Sweden. And also they used herbicides to remove deciduous trees, and they selectively, or deliberately, I should say, felled deciduous trees out of forest stands, which really led to this very much coniferous dominated forest that we have. And then in 1993, there was the new Swedish Forestry Act, which had some sort of mentions of sustainable forest management and the need to mimic natural disturbance that occurs through natural fires. But still, our predominant method of timber extraction is clear cutting today. And I've talked about structural complexity before, but this has basically led to this reduced structural complexity. So these two pictures are kind of sort of simplified versions of a simple forest on the left and a complex forest on the right. And you can see the simple forest has a very even age structure. There's little variation in tree size. The trees are densely planted, low species richness of the trees, very little understory, very close canopy cover, and very little gaps. And the opposite would be true when we have a structurally complex forest. So that's structural complexity, and that's one aspect of forests that's very important to consider. But another important aspect is microclimate. I would say from the start, I am not a microclimate expert. We already have Caroline Grieser in Researcher's Desk, who is very much this is very much her domain. And I will talk about some of her research as well, because it's very important here. But I just want to give a kind of a brief overview about microclimate in forests and what it is we're interested in. Often we measure things like relative humidity, and also temperature. And with the temperature, we're interested in the temperature offset. And what I mean by that is we measure the temperature in the ambient open air conditions, and we compare that to the temperature within the forest itself. And then we can determine whether the forest may be providing a cooling effect, so it's cooler in the forest compared to ambient air, or whether it's warmer in the forest compared to ambient air. And this is really important now in the face of a warming climate, that we might want to favour forests that provide this cooling effect. Because when you have a cooler forest, it could provide microrefugia for species that require slightly lower temperatures. And I should say that forests are typically having a cooling effect in the day, but a warming effect at night. So what drives microclimate? Well, as you can see from this figure that I've taken from an article from Dufresne, it's very, very complex. And it shows here two example biomes, the boreal and the temperate. And there are many different factors that interact and interplay with each other to determine microclimate. And forest cover and structure is a very important one. When we have a more, maybe a more closed canopy and a more like structurally complex understory and midstory, then we actually get a benefit in terms of the temperature offset. So we get this buffering effect. We can get cooler temperatures within the forest, which might provide microrefugia for a species. But then we can have effects of things like forest management might affect that structure and then have a negative effect. And also now we have problems with like pests. For example, the spruce bark beetle is a big problem now in Sweden, where it defoliates the trees and kills trees. And this obviously will have an effect on the forest cover and structure, which then could affect the microclimate. And also forest fires, for example. But forest fragmentation is also a big issue. When we fragment forests, we create more edges. And the edge of forests have been shown to have a lower buffering capacity than the internal parts of forests. So a little bit onto some of the research that has been done and some of the things that we see. Something that's sort of come out quite repeatedly and has been shown by Caroline is that humidity is really important in terms of microclimate in forests. And that when we have forests that have wetter soils, they have a higher ability to buffer the negative effects of a warming climate. So wet forests are really important. And we know that understory vegetation increases humidity. It traps the humidity within the forest and creates a more humid microclimate. So having this complex understory, midstory is really vital. And Caroline has shown that bryophytes and lichens really benefit from this moisture and also from tree cover. So having a good cover of trees, particularly coniferous trees, really benefited. This is a transplant experiment that she done, and she found that they did much better when there was higher soil moisture and tree cover. But on to my favourite taxa, bats. I also have seen that bat activity increases more in humid forests. And this has actually been driven by understory vegetation. So when we have more understory vegetation, it is more humid and there is more bat activity. And similarly, insect abundances increase with humidity, especially things like mosquitoes, has been shown before. So on to temperature. We know that dense and more shaded forests can be cooler. And this it's been shown to provide microrefugia for vascular plants, mosses, liverworts, lichens. This is research that Caroline has done. So having these kind of more developed canopies are really, really important for those species. And we've also seen that forests with more open understories are warmer. So this is from my own research. I find that when we have open understories, the temperature is much higher in these forests, which could have benefits or negative effects on species, depending on which taxa we're thinking about. And in my case, I was looking at bats, and I actually found that bat activity was also positively associated with these warmer temperatures in the forest. But I think one thing we have to bear in mind is that, yeah, I found that result in my study, but with warming climates, what's the threshold for this? They just can't increase with increasing temperature forever. There's going to be a threshold where too warm a forest is not going to be beneficial for them. We've already seen huge deaths of bats, fruit bats in Australia because of rising temperatures. So there definitely will be a threshold point. But also insect abundance has been shown to be increased in warmer forests too. But I imagine as well, this will also have some sort of threshold. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about forest structure and how that affects biodiversity. And I should say this is very complex. Different taxa respond in very different ways. And it sort of shows that we need to, think about this in quite a detailed way and look at different taxa. So I've looked at bats, of course, and we find that having gaps in the canopy is really important for bats. And this probably is a little bit to do with that they are able to catch insects easier when there are some gaps in the forest. So insects have less places to hide and they're able to be more successful in their foraging. But also that if the forest is too dense, it's just too dense for them to navigate and fly. So some gaps are important, even for species that are very much adapted to flying in forests. Canopy height is important. And this is probably to do with the fact that when we have a higher canopy, we also have probably more mature trees. And many bat species are actually roosting in trees. So they need mature trees with holes and crevices to live in. But also the variation in tree height is really important. So having this uneven edge in forests is really crucial. And this probably also creates gaps, which allow navigation and ease of foraging. But understory openness was also really important for my bats. And I think this is again to do with the ease of foraging. When you have a very dense understory, insects, and especially like moths, for example, will hide in the undergrowth, and it makes it much harder for bats to forage on them. And actually, I also looked at moths in this project, and I found, interestingly, they had the total opposite response to bats. So actually having a more variable tree height and more open understory had a negative effect on moths. So here we see that even with a predator and a prey, we find very contrasting responses to structural complexity. And equally, the study that's down below by Klein et al. Was a study done in Swedish forestry, somewhere near Uppsala, I believe. They found that having an open understory above 3 meters was really important for lichens, but having an open understory below 3 meters was really important for birds. So it just shows that these different taxa have really contrasting needs. And I think that's kind of the main message I want to get across today is that structural complexity is complex and we need forests that really provide ecosystems for all these different taxa. So we need heterogeneity in our forests, and that's what we don't have right now. We have forests that are very homogeneous. So we need to provide a variety of conditions, variety of openness and closed environments, understory, midstory, to really meet the ecological requirements of a broad range of taxa. And I just want to take it a little bit onto wet forests, particularly swamp forests. We've talked about microclimate and how humidity is really important. And we've talked about how structural complexity is really important. And actually, these habitats kind of meet both of those requirements very well. So swamp forests are naturally wet. They have more structural complexity because you have lots of deadwood, standing deadwood, fallen deadwood, variety of age of trees. And these habitats have been quite neglected. And because we drain so much forest in Sweden, we have very little of this left. But there is now a kind of an awareness that we need to restore some of this habitat again. There was a paper that came out actually from the UK just last year, talking about how these wet forests provide very key ecological features and can provide nature-based solutions. And this infographic tries to kind of outline some of that. So having trees that are able to tolerate waterlogging is really important. So things like alder and willow. Having frequent tree fall and wet ground provides the structural complexity that we need in different ages of trees. Having pools and ridges, deadwood, creates some microtopography, which is really important, creates this heterogeneous environment. And also, the exchange of greenhouse gases is primarily controlled by the water table and the temperature. So having this really helps with that. And waterlogged conditions slow the decomposition of dead wood and vegetation, and this allows for peat accumulation. And we all know that peat is a very good carbon sink. So really, I kind of want to do a call that we really need to do more research on these habitats in Sweden. I think they're so important. Um, Luckily, even though it's maybe not the law that we wanted, the nature restoration law does call very specifically for restoring forests and also re-wetting of drained peatlands, including peatlands in forests. Um, I know that the wording of the text is weaker than everyone would have hoped for, but I think there is at least some hope that maybe we might be able to translate this into Swedish law and have more restoration of forests and particularly wet forests. And they do specifically mention about like complexity, having more dead wood. We need an uneven edge structure. Um, so let's hope that this actually achieves something. And in Sweden, we do have already money allocated for rewetting of peatlands. They're not just forest peatlands, but peatlands in total. So it was 3.7 billion kroner was put forward to be invested in this by 2030. And these are the numbers of what's been rewetted so far. It was 830 in the first year, and it went up to 1,500, and it went down a bit in 2023. And there's no figures yet for 2024. But if you're interested at all in re-wetting and the climate benefits of it, I can really suggest this book that came out last year from Amalie Lindgren, who was a former PhD student at Stockholm University, now at Gothenburg, and her colleague Ossa. It's available as a PDF to download for free online if you want to. And it's really, really excellent and really puts a lot about this in perspective and why we need to re-wet forests. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for listening. And if anyone has questions that they don't have time to ask today, please feel free to email me either at SU or SLU. And thank you very much for listening.
And thank you for a super pedagogic and talk and really interesting research that you're doing.